Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Derek Bros to discuss a couple of really important articles that he put out recently. One in particular around the spyware element and the growing reality of that, but in specific in the context of Donald Trump's incoming administration, and overlapping that with an interesting point about the Israeli, as I would write, infiltration of this field, pointing out that some close to 50% of the field of spyware is actually Israeli startups, which are directly connected to their intelligence apparatus, and talking about how concerning that may be with what seems to be this kind of unfettered regulatory reality for the technocratic drive coming during Trump's next administration. And he also wrote about recently this new development between Elon Musk, SpaceX, and the National Reconnaissance, the NRO, the group that is ultimately behind the majority of surveillance for even the NSA and other groups behind that, and stating in their own conversations that you can't hide. And this is being done under the guise of the outsiders, the rebels fighting the deep state. And maybe you can make sense of that. To me, it seems to be the same old thing being built out around us. And so we're going to talk with Derek and the research he's done around this, and maybe overlap it with some conversations of this weird drone story. So Derek, how are you, brother? Good to see you again. Oh, got you muted.
Let me see. Thanks for having me back on, brother. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good. This is a good, important take on an interesting developing story. What I find interesting is that during this, really this weird, I keep talking about this weird limbo period that every 4 years we get this like gap between when the president's no longer technically still president, but the president-elect is in power. You know what I mean? It's like anything good, they'll claim. Anything bad, it's still their fault. And it's like this weird time. And so right now, the point in that is that in that time, the partisan fervor is pretty crazy. And I think that's interesting that you're highlighting some very clear concerns that I would argue even more so Republicans were highlighting during COVID-19, the Great Reset conversation, and are suddenly now, in some cases, there's plenty of conservatives calling it out, but in some cases just kind of cheering on the good guy version of the same thing, right? The good guy AI, the good guy technocratic control structure. So let's start with, okay, do you want to open with something? Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say to that point you were making there that just in case anybody is going to hear the rest of this conversation, and it probably will be more focused on the Trump, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel cabal side of things, you can go back to the articles I wrote before the ones we're going to cover today when I looked at Joe Biden's legacy as well. So we're looking at all sides at this point. We're not letting Biden just, kind of slip away into the night without calling out some of the things that he's been responsible for.
Right. Well, it's funny. I do take issue with the idea that we always have to counterbalance the statements, because it's an objectively a clear thing that we pointed out, but it gets taken as, well, therefore you don't point out the other side. We all know that it's frustrating. The point is obvious that from our perspective, as we've been highlighting, that it's more so about the illusion of it all that is just the current power structure. So we're highlighting the issues being rolled out by the incoming administration, not so much because that's right or left. And I think Derek's done great work on this. And this is one of the ones I was going to point out in a minute, whether through Biden or Harris or Trump, digital IDs are coming to America. And that's what we're trying to get at. And I seem to be focusing more on that incoming power structure because I just think it's obvious that they have more influence over the outcome from the political side of it. And I think that's what we can see with every house, that, executive, Senate, House. I mean, it's very clear that they have that kind of influence. So I'm glad you point that out, though, because same point, the fervor of the partisan side of this, people will tend to kind of reflexively push away from something they sense is highlighting the person that they support. So I'm glad you pointed that out. But
yeah, and even before we fully dive into that, just one other quick thing. We're recording this in the middle of December, so Biden's got just a couple of weeks left. And part of what I was pointing out with that article that you just showed there, I know we'll talk more about digital IDs in a few minutes, but part of what I was pointing out there is that there is a draft of an executive order that has been seen by, probably a dozen or more people, maybe more at this point, which has been in draft form for several months now, maybe even up to a year, that the Biden administration is apparently holding on to. And I wouldn't be surprised if that draft executive order that I wrote about in that article does get, put into place right before he leaves office. And that would be an executive order about accelerating the push towards mobile driver's licenses or digital driver's licenses.
Yeah, no, that's a really important one that I've been highlighting, the dual aspect of the two-party illusion part of it, right? Where you bring in the overlap to the SAVE Act, right? Which ultimately opens the door to real ID compliant, which is digital ID, period. and ultimately then, but allowing other options in the bill. But then I pointed out, if and when this comes to pass from Biden's side of it, it effectively creates a circumstance where eventually, as they outline, your paper versions will eventually be null and void, and the digital on phone version is what you'll use, which then when you combine these two things, then all you end up with is real ID compliant identification. And then both sides point at the other for why they were responsible for letting this happen. And you make a good point about, or I'm glad you point out the idea of the executive order and how this works in the limbo period. So let's say Biden passes this on the way out. It's an easy thing for Trump to say, see, the Biden Democrat, they're the problem. They passed this. But then how hard do they work to try to return that over? You know, they like, you could just write another executive order. I'm going to argue that's not what happens.
I would guess that he's going to do what every other president has done before him and say, we don't need to look backwards. We need to look forward.
Yes, right. It's all about unity when you want it to be, right? But I think it's important to see that ends up being, you give him an out because he says they're the bad problem, but he doesn't actually try to stop it. And my point is that's the illusion of how this continues to keep us divided into the guys that are fighting each other when really their plans seem to work in unison to achieve these things. So you wrote the article, meet the spyware companies preparing to unleash their tech during Trump's second administration. And again, the point being is that I would argue this was going to happen regardless of what selection was made. That'd be my opinion. But so what really alarmed me about this is the first point in general, just in a broad sense, before we even get to this point, is how crazy it is that we're in the position where this is still like, it's like a benign story almost for some people, despite the history of the NSA conversation that in and of itself just kind of got kicked aside. Yeah, we lied 14 times over. Yes, we're spying on you, but it's for your safety. And everyone just went on. You know, it's like, it's just crazy. And so here, that overlap is important that you see whether it's Israeli spyware or not, which we'll get to. Just the fact that we're still in this field, that Americans aren't recognizing how invasive this stuff is or just don't choose to. I just even comments, and I just think that's very crazy how we can't seem to get past these things. Any of them, it seems.
Yeah, and you know, the reason I thought that this article was important to write is not just, as you said, to kind of point the direction at what's going to happen with the incoming Trump administration, which is a big part of it for sure. I think to your other point that it probably would have happened either way, like, you know, the acceleration of spyware by various U.S. government agencies, that's probably in the cards already, just because we're headed towards the surveillance state day by day. But I do think, you know, as much as I agree with you about the selection aspect, for whatever reason, the narrative being Trump won and, you know, now he's going to come clean house or whatever, his rhetoric around the largest deportation operation in history and all that sort of stuff, it's clear that the different companies that are involved with spyware, and I also talk about companies that are involved with what are they called? When you're on house arrest, like ankle monitors and stuff like that, that all of the industry behind that, including the private prison industry, who is going to stand to benefit to the tune of probably billions of dollars to temporarily or long-term house people who are going to be deported. Because it's not like, I think people have this image that they're going to just go find the local illegal cook at your your local restaurant and put them on a bus and send them back to Mexico. And it's not going to be like that. There's going to be a whole process, which, you know, and in some cases is probably better, right? You're not just throwing people across the border. There's going to be bureaucracy around that. And that bureaucracy is going to need more bureaucracy in companies. Who's going to build those shelters that hold the people temporarily? Who's going to monitor them to make sure that they come back for court dates and all this sort of thing, which I discussed in my previous article about the Biden administration, how the reason there is a real immigration problem is because of decisions that were made during the Biden administration, the Obama administration. And I would think there's even some things under Trump that, you know, he could have easily fixed some of these issues if he wanted to.
Real quick, Venezuelan point. Don't forget that Rubio was on record responsible for petitioning and driving more of the Venezuelan refugee program. Like, so just to your point, exactly. So it's both sides of this dynamic for different reasons. Go ahead.
Yeah. And as we reported at the time, like Trump was, you know, a big cheerleader for the attempted coup in Venezuela, and it's interference like that in other countries, which leads to the blowback that causes people to want to come to the United States in the first place. You know, they're not just leaving for no reason. There's turmoil and things happening at home, and they decide, you know what, this potentially dangerous journey, the life-ending journey is worth the risk, so we're going to go make it. But nevertheless, this problem of immigration has been building up for some time. And so then Trump gets to step into this role of like, I'm going to be the one to finally fix it. The Democrats are crazy, and they did all these policies that clearly anybody with a brain, and I think it's true, anybody with a brain could look at these policies and say like, that's not going to end up good. Right. You're going to lose children. Why are you doing that? well, then it allows Trump to and these various companies to kind of step into that space and say, well, look, I'm going to do this better. And as he has signaled, and you can find this in statements made by Trump, you can find it in the Republican Party platform under Trump, and just different speeches he's given, that he is not anti-technology, not to say that he should be or anything like that, but he's definitely going to use technology like facial recognition, like biometrics, et cetera, to create this massive system that he wants. So we shouldn't expect that he's going to like shy away from these companies who are already coming a calling to the Immigration Customs Enforcement, to ICE. As soon as Trump got elected, as I point out in the article, ICE was petitioning different companies for contracts for technologies which will be useful for tracking people and which will be useful for housing people and things of that sort. Some of which includes these companies here that I'm highlighting, these spyware companies that have been around for years. You know, for those who aren't familiar with the term spyware, you know, it comes from the idea of software. Software is, of course, something like a program you can load to your laptop, to your phone, your computer, things of that sort. Spyware, as the name implies, is simply software or a program that is there to spy on you and to gather data from you. And as you mentioned, Ryan, we know about the NSA's efforts through tapping the undersea cables of the internet, through phone and cellular data collection. This is different in the sense that this is specifically companies, many of which who are associated with Israeli intelligence, who are developing software, spyware programs that they can remotely infect phones, computers, et cetera, and gather all kinds of data. And then, of course, where that data goes after that, maybe to law enforcement, maybe to the government, maybe back to the same Israeli firms with connections to Israel, Israeli intelligence like Unit 8200. And they are bragging that they can crack encrypted messaging on WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, and Facebook Messenger. And not to say that those four that I just mentioned, besides maybe Signal, are like the pinnacle of, you know, encrypted messaging, but Facebook does claim that they have some level of encryption. Telegram does have a one-on-one encrypted messaging option, and WhatsApp is allegedly encrypted too. And then Signal, of course, is seen as like the kind of the pinnacle or the, you know, the top encrypted messaging app. I think there's reasons to be skeptical and careful with that as well. But nevertheless, these are the ones they're focusing on. And if they're focusing on these ones, we can just assume that they probably have the ability to crack others as well. So that's kind of what my article is looking at in a broad picture. We can get deeper into the details, but how all of these different companies that are starting to contract with ICE, specifically the one I start with is $2 million 1-year contract from Paragon Solutions, which is just a company that when I started to look into them, like, yeah, there's been a few reports, mainly from the Wall Street Journal over the last couple of years, but they're not a household name that I've really heard anybody else in our broader community mention. So it felt to me kind of important to not only highlight them, but to highlight just the danger of where spyware really is going. Like the way I sort of see this is you could compare it to something like facial recognition or maybe artificial intelligence, where, you know, I'm not the guy to say like, let's get the government to ban the things and assume that's going to fix stuff. But we are dealing with new levels of technology that is, you know, as many of the people that were referenced in the article I wrote here, some of the so-called experts, that we're really in uncharted territory when it comes to this technology. I mean, there's just, how do governments even protect from it? Even if we believe the governments were benevolent and really trying to protect us and our communications, like let's imagine the US government really did care about that. Well, you still got the Israeli government, you got the UK government, you got other governments who are freely contracting with these companies. And it's not just about spying on their own citizens, it's about spying on pretty much anybody they want. And this technology does allow them to do so with pretty much anyone in the world. So that, I think, is the bigger, scarier kind of question and conversation around this is like, is there any way to stop it from getting worse? I really don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of break it into two things, because it's not just because the Israeli overlap. I think that should be concerning for obvious objective reasons in the world today and their invasive actions within this field. But your point just about the field itself, and that it is a very clearly growing dynamic that overlaps with a lot of the things you just mentioned, so let's taking one step back to the border dynamic. And you've made this point very clear that it's obvious, even with, you know, let's just say good intentions. It's like hard even saying that with how clearly I think there's not, you know, but let's just say that, you know, doing this for the right reasons, whatever you think that would be. Well, they've already made it clear that will necessitate camps or whatever you want to call them. So at first point, for people that have in every point conversation of the past been the ones to point out the FEMA camps or the different example. Well, here you go. It's literally being outlined and displayed for what we need to do. But because, and this is what I was highlighting before, it's the good guy version. Right. It's easy to go, oh, well, they're doing it for the reason I like. So we, and that's a problem. But all the rest of it, right? It's going to necessitate an increase in surveillance, an increase in biometric tracking, like they're telling you is coming. And this overlaps with all these conversations we're seeing. So they justify it saying that we have, have to secure the border. We have to shut this down. We've got immigrants we have to deport. Well, that is going to be, as you've highlighted in more than one article, the deployment of potentially military, as there's highlighting, and just state of emergency, which it's going to increase and solidify not a surveillance state, but a technocratic surveillance state, which is where this is going, that we'll never go back from. Every time that's happened, Patriot Act never went back. COVID-19 never went back. Right. So that's where I see coming for this. And it even overlaps, which we'll get into in the next article and afterward, this potential drone conversation. Right? Because let me play this clip, actually, since this relates with all the stuff we're talking about. You guys have seen this, but this is what Trump said not too long ago. And it is very clearly something that, without it directly overlaps with the spyware, with the biometric tracking, with the border conversation, and even with the drone point. Because how do you think they're going to be using biometric tracking?
Number 8, we will finally complete the biometric entry-exit visa tracking system, which we need desperately. For years, Congress has required biometric entry-exit visa tracking systems, but it has never been completed. The politicians are all talk, no action, never happens, never happens. Hillary Clinton, all talk. Unfortunately, when there is action, it's always the wrong decision. Do you ever notice? In my administration, we will ensure that this system is in place. And I will tell you, it will be on land, it will be on sea, it will be in air. We will have a proper tracking system.
Wow. You're muted, brother.
What are your thoughts on that? What we're talking about today.
Yeah. So first of all, it brings up a few different things, man. And like after I wrote that article about Biden and I was going deeper into the immigration issue, it is a complex issue. I'll give it that, right? There are some dumb, obvious moves that have been made that, like I said earlier, set you up for failure. And so it's like, okay, change those policies. Well, one of the policies that the Biden administration changed, which Trump appears to be saying he's going to fix, of course, he's going to go above and beyond, and it's going to be completely, biometric wall, smart wall, et cetera, though, is the fact that the Biden administration, and I think it actually started during the Obama administration, but it continued for sure during the Biden administration, that they ended the practice of DNA collection for sponsors. So as I write in that article, when there's an unaccompanied migrant child that comes across, they hold him, and sometimes maybe they have notes or something, or they have some sort of information, and they're supposed to find them a sponsor, which is, in the best case, a family member that's in the United States, and they connect them, they prove, okay, this is your family member, you know each other, IDs are shown, they do background checks, like that. Those are all the things that the Biden administration stopped doing, but they're supposed to do background checks, and that is supposed to include some level of biometrics, probably a DNA test of some sort. And those policies were ended or, reversed under Biden and Obama. So I asked myself, because obviously we both see the danger in what Trump is talking about there, land, sea, and air, biometrics, all the stuff that many of us are fighting. And I understand that, and I can see that. And then from the other side of how do we fix the immigration problem? How do we solve this not knowing if a child coming across and the person that says, oh yeah, I swear this is my nephew or my niece or whatever. And there's all kinds of crazy cases that the kid's showing up looking drugged. The kid's like clearly trafficking situation going on. And there was people trying to warn them. All those different mechanisms that are supposed to be there to protect the children failed or were ignored, et cetera. And I think we can safely assume by design. But I guess what I'm getting at is how do we solve that problem without promoting more biometrics? Like, what I mean? Like, I don't know what the perfect answer is in that case, because obviously I'm against Trump, wanting to do full on biometrics, and because from there, like you already said, it's going to expand. It starts with voting, and then it goes, you got to use it everywhere. Then it becomes, you got to use it to get on the internet and whatever else. Right. And at the same time, immigrants aren't going to stop coming to the U.S. even if they slow it down. And Trump does a big deportation operation. There will always be immigration, legal and illegal. It's just part of having a border. And how do we improve that situation? We're not going to solve that right here, but that's just where my mind goes. Is like, damn, we're like kind of stuck in between, a rock and a hard place. Like, we don't want to promote biometrics. And at the same time, that seems like that might be one way, DNA testing or something, some level of, more than they're doing now, at the very least, a background check, like show a picture with this person and a family member or something. Right. So yeah, that's kind of where my mind went on that whole thing, is just how do we fix one problem without encouraging the solution we know they want to promote, which we know will lead bad places.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Absolutely. What's interesting is that is a good example of how a well-crafted psychological operation would work. I mean, I'm not saying we can. I think that's what that is. You can decide if you think so, but hypothetically speaking, a perfectly well-crafted psychological operation, or rather just specifically a like problem reaction solution dynamic, would be just like that, where like the question should be asked, first of all, it's important to ask in that context whether they're involved with creating that problem. That clearly would matter, right? Or then even if they're not, whether they even care to stop it, right? Those things really matter, because then the intention is very different than, the point would be, why are they then stepping in to do this? And clearly the point we're arguing is, even if they want to stop the problem, it's the solution is a bigger problem in and of itself as it comes to our rights and so on. And again, back to the first point, is if they are involved with creating the problem, that's exactly what we're talking about. But a well-crafted psychological operation does just that, where you're going, I get the logic of it. Like, I get where they're putting you. Like, that does solve this to a degree. The question is there a bigger problem being created by being driven into what you see as all the choices, but as usual, it's a false binary, right? That's well done. I mean,
yeah, and you're right. Those are the telltale signs of a good psychological operation, or just that sort of problem reaction solution situation, because the person who's manufacturing or sort of guiding that operation, they want you to feel conflicted, and to the point of saying like, well, yeah, I do have these values and these principles, and I've held on to them, but this situation is so bad, it requires me to let them go and to ignore all the things that I know, could come from this, because I want to fix this one problem.
I totally agree, but I would even take it a step further and say a perfect crafted version of that would be where you don't feel conflicted, where it makes perfect sense, but you realize that, well, like, get the biometric issue, like, let's just say it was something that didn't conflict with what we wanted, but we would still be going, hold on, though, I don't think they're doing this for the right reasons, and what are they going to drive around it? And so it's well done, though. Like, I think that's the problem, is that it's always about, what about the children? And of course we care about the children. Of course we care. They don't care about the children. And that's where it gets very concerning for me. I want to read some things I highlighted in your article, and I'm sure there's more in this. So make sure you read this one that he was just highlighting, the Biden administration's legacy of migrant child trafficking. I just want to pluck out some of the ones I just grabbed really quickly. There's more in here you should check out. But this is being quoted, and this was Tara Rodas from the volunteer at the Pomona Fairplex Emergency Intake Site in California. He says, quote, "If I had not seen it with my own eyes, I do not believe I could accept that a federal government agency is responsible for using billions of taxpayer dollars annually to put children in the homes of gang members. It Oh, did you lose me there? Did you lose me, Derek? You still there?
Yeah, I'm here. It just froze for a moment while you were reading the quote.
Anyway, so that's okay. It looks like we lost connection there on my end. That's interesting. Anyway, the point was simple, that if you read the article and what she's highlighting, that it's very clear that it's like, there's no like accident. Like, they're going out there, she's calling them out for ignoring the process, removing, like, stopping the checks of what they might need to make sure that the parents, like, it's just grotesque. And maybe there's some other reason, but I think it's pretty nefarious on its face. And so the point that we're just making is that this is how you make a very well set up discussion to justify anything else. Right. And so here we are jumping into this. So we have back to this article, though, the spyware being rolled out under the administration. I want to make sure to reiterate that in that field, was it 46% in the article of the entire field in the world is Israeli startups directly tied to intelligence. And this is being rushed out around this country. And I think that's pretty terrifying. I wanted to note, this one was about spyware. I just saw this online. This is as of October 10th of this year. It says Israeli firm.
It's not showing on the screen, by the way.
Oh, thank you. That was just my fault. So this is a tweet that's shared by Robert. I just looked up Israeli spyware to see what would pop up in regard to what people are talking about. It's an article right here saying Israeli firm taught U.S. police how to target Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and January 6th protesters. Of course, because it's nonpartisan when you really break it all down, right? And it's always being used against you. But so this is Israeli spyware that's immersed. So it's part of the official discussion of what our governments are using against us. And I find that to be pretty terrifying. And so we can roll this into, the digital ID aspect of this is very important, but we can talk about the next article you wrote. And the point is, we get digital IDs at any point. We should talk about how it overlaps with all this, because it's very obvious that that's, as we wrote in the IMA panel discussion, the foundation of technocracy. It'll be one of the earliest points in this, and that is the biometric aspect. So tell me about this article, Derek, and how you think these overlap, if at all, because I think there is clearly a connection, whether it's drones or biometrics, but does overlap with satellite and surveillance. But the article's entitled, "You Can't Hide." So whether they connect or not, we're talking about the increase of surveillance state. Elon Musk and SpaceX are helping U.S. intelligence build the world's largest spy satellite network. So tell us about this and why we should be concerned.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. They both connect because they're part of the broader surveillance conversation. Before we jump into that one, I wanted to make one other point, though, on the spyware companies. Just we were talking about how that relates to ICE. I mentioned that there's been a $2 million contract signed earlier this year by Paragon Solutions. I just wanted to make the point that that is actually just the latest and contracts that ICE has signed with various companies. They've actually signed $20 million worth of contracts for spyware, surveillance, and forensic tech in just the last 4 months, in the 3 months leading up to the election, and then since then. And so, like I said earlier, whether this probably would have continued and, it picked up at similar pace, whether it was Kamala or Trump in office. But it does seem like Trump winning and all his rhetoric about, deporting and stuff has signaled to certain companies and to ICE, like, hey, we need to be prepared. We need to get ready. So one of the contracts I found was ICE they're looking for methods to verify biometrics with a smartphone or a tablet using facial recognition or other means. And they're specifically looking for vendors who can, quote, provide devices that track participants' activities and movements via geolocation, offer identity verification, and offer one or two-way communication capabilities with ICE to assist ICE with ensuring compliance with release requirements and court orders. Now, that's what I was mentioning earlier, that when they hold people, they might say, okay, well, look, you've been found to be here illegally. They might kick him out, but there might be cases where they say, we need you to come back to ICE's court and, come check it out again. This is kind of the reverse of the problem they have when people are coming in. They're supposed to set the kids up with a sponsor, and then they're supposed to come back every 30 days and be seen. But that's where you hear this number about like missing kids. I don't think we can for certain say they're missing yet, but they definitely are not keeping up with them. And so, we could maybe assume. But nevertheless, so these companies are now contracting with Trump, or with the incoming Trump administration, with ICE, in anticipation of Trump coming in for tracking devices, biometrics, et cetera. But the other point I wanted to make about this is that one of the companies, Geo Group, which is a private prison contractor, one of the biggest ones in the United States, after Trump was elected, he gave an interview where he said that he's expecting they're going to make $400 million annually under Trump by filling up the beds with individuals who've been accused of illegal immigration. This is where we're talking about the FEMA camps, internment camps, whatever you want to say. There's going to be housing, and there's going to be a lot of money to be made on this. And here's where more of the swampiness comes in. Trump's pick for Attorney General, Pam Bondi, she was a former lobbyist at the Geo Group. So you start to see like, okay, so the private prison industry is about to benefit to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year because of Trump's rhetoric about getting rid of immigrants, because of a situation that we know was allowed to expand to this point where people are literally begging to get rid of all the bad guys. And the companies and corporations like Geo Group, I guarantee you these people do not give a crap about the sentimental stories that you're falling for and please save the children. They're caring about the $400 million annually that they stand to make under a Trump administration. So you've got somebody going from being a lobbyist for them and then now being put in the highest, or nominated for at least, the highest law enforcement position in the United States, the Attorney General. And in that position, she will be directly involved with shaping immigration policy. And obviously, she could make it in a way that's going to benefit her former contractor, Geo Group. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's a lot more swamp on the Trump side, want to admit. And if people want to read the rest of this article, I do encourage you to I didn't go super deep with every one of these other companies. There's some that are more well-known, like Clearview AI, but Boldened, Celebrite, Magnetic Forensics, Penlink. These are companies that we should probably be aware of, because I'm sure we're going to see them coming up more in the coming years.
And if I remember correctly, most of those are Israeli companies, right? Or at least the majority of them you listed off. And I think,
and like you said, that there's a report that I quoted from the Atlantic Council, interestingly, from just September, and it was all about spyware. And it said that most of the vendors, because you've got like the companies that create this stuff, the spyware companies, you got vendors. There's just like a whole apparatus to this industry. Most of them are based in Israel, India, and Italy. They call it the 3 Eyes, but nearly 50% of them are coming from Israel. And there's other companies like the NSO Group, who's probably made the most attention over the last couple of years because of the Pegasus leaks that people may or may not have heard about. I do a little recap of that in this article, but there's others. And these names, like I said, they're not household names yet that you might have heard about, like Palantir or something. But I guarantee you, we're going to see more and more of these different names, and we're going to see more and more spyware being deployed, both by private companies, because that's the other big difference, right? On one hand, when we talk about surveillance, you got the NSA, that's government surveillance, taking taxpayer dollars, developing different tools to hack and spy or go to the courts and ask for FISA warrants or whatever. These are private companies who are working with hackers who've been trained by the intelligence firms to develop tools specifically to crack encryption and messaging apps, and then sell those programs, that spyware, that software, to governments and to law enforcement. So whether it's coming directly from the governments and the cops, or is being sold to them by private entities, we've just got so many people trying to get in our stuff. And I would encourage people to check out, just one other note on this, encourage people to check out a documentary. It's by HBO. I don't encourage you to give HBO your money, but if you search around, you can find it. It's called Surveilled, and it just came out in the last couple months. And actually, I didn't even know about it till I was finishing my article, and I decided to watch it sort of as part of my research. But much of what I discuss here is discussed there. They talk about the Pegasus leaks and the NSO Group, and how this is just, it's like I said earlier, it's rising to a level now where, most experts in this field of digital rights and digital security are not sure how anybody's privacy is going to be protected in the near-term future, if to whatever degree it already is, right?
Right. Well, I was going to say, even not just an opinion, but stated by people in that very field, that it very well may have been, we may have passed that line a long time ago, right? And we're just not aware of that. But so, I mean,
absolutely.
Think about, speaking of the problem, reaction, solution to it, and it's a general concept that people tend to, it can apply anywhere, but just consider how easy it would be. I mean, I guess just to start with the fact that I think we should all acknowledge that our government has been very clear about the direction, both left and right, about the technological advancement, right? These are things that they've been trying to remove rights every which way they can, and from both sides. So think about how easy it would be to simply create this dichotomy, to create during Biden's administration an influx, which nobody's denying, at least not here, about the problem that's created. And then how easy it would be to have Trump swing in with this next administration and say, well, now we're going to bring them all back out and create the opening for exactly what we're talking about. Or maybe they're not even aware of that, but just consider how easy that might have been to accomplish. And so now they're going to be the biometrics, the drone aspect, the surveillance, I mean, all the things we might talk about. So I just want to point that out. I know many of you probably already had that in your mind, and it's not there, something we can verify, but we have to consider that might be happening. That's how governments operate. Now, before we move past the next one thing I really think stands out when you read that last time, when it says accused of illegal immigration, I think that tends to get skipped over, right? And you made a point about that. So they're erring on the side of the big boogeyman that we need to remove from the country. And I think that's being broadly, like, wildly overrepresented. But to the point you made earlier, well, then we should care. There's people that were let in that were criminals, or that they're people that are here illegally. That should matter. But when you say accused, that opens the door, like all the rest of this, to a broad stroke, application of what? That they have a different skin color? I mean, how would you really imply that from a perspective of people on the street? So if you just touch on that point, I think that's important.
I think that is a hugely important point. And not only what you're saying there, but we already know that Donald Trump has been speaking in support of stop and frisk measures and wanting to bring back the horrible post 9/11 stop and frisk measures. And for those who either weren't paying attention or just didn't, care at the time, but in the post 9/11 era, up until maybe the last 5 or 10 years, when I know they finally got rid of it, but there was stop and frisk in places like New York City, obviously, where 9/11 happened, where the cops could pretty much just go up to anybody. And yes, they typically were brown-skinned people who maybe looked they would assume they were Muslim. They could be Palestinian, they could be Sikh, they could be whatever, but they had a turban on or something. So they go check them out and question them, and they could pat them down, they could bother them, they could take them to the station, they could try to turn them into informants, and all of that was considered completely legal. And I think you're
for sure.
Yeah, totally unconstitutional, but they consider it to be legal, as far as they're concerned. And, so when you mention that caveat of, like, they say, people who are suspected of being illegal immigrants and things like that. Another thing that I've seen Trump stating that does concern me in terms of how this whole thing's going to be carried out. And none of us know for sure, but when they're discussing using the military, he's like, well, maybe we'll use them. We'll see if it comes to that. It's just not even a fun place to be where they're playing with that idea. Right. And I might have mentioned this to you in the past, but when it comes to the whole immigration thing, I mean, this is definitely something that I do think it should matter to people, whether you know any immigrants or not. Because, for example, my partner, she's born in the U.S., Mexican parents. They came over. They were naturalized in the 90s, so they're legal, but they have some family members and probably friends of family members who come over who do a lot of work that Americans don't want to do, who may not have their current paperwork because of how messed up the system is. And Trump is, they're asking him in these recent interviews he just did, well, what are you going to do when there's a child who came over illegally, or one person, but then the rest of the family may have the proper paperwork, and are you going to separate families? And he's like, well, we don't want to separate families again, because that made such a big stink last time when he was in office. You guys might remember that. So they're saying, well, what Trump is saying, and you can find him quoting him saying this directly, we'll deport the entire family. So what does that really look like? None of us know. Like, when you got a mixed family of some people who maybe have come illegally, some people who have, but you don't want to separate the family, and his solution is just deport the whole family. I don't know what the heck that means exactly, or how that looks, but yeah, I think you're right to kind of zero in on that, people being suspected of illegal immigration and how that could be easily expanded. And then we do end up in a place where stop and frisk is back. Trump also wants to give police even more immunity and things of that sort. So you could end up in a really bad place where your civil liberties don't matter if you have a shade of skin that's, slightly dark. If it's not just totally bright white, then maybe they think, if you got a mustache, you look slightly Italian or something. It could just open up the door to all sorts of profiling of people who are perfectly, legal and doing nothing but exercising their constitutional rights.
Exactly. And really, to make it easy for people to digest, to just pull away the racial aspect to it. I mean, that's obviously the relevant part of this, but it's really just about them saying, I suspect something, nothing's proven, and so now I'm going to violate your rights. So it doesn't matter what the real justification is, that's wrong. That's unconstitutional. And ultimately, going back to the same point from Mayberry versus Madison, Supreme Court ruling, it is null and void. Something that is repugnant to the Constitution is technically not legal. Now, they can pass a law all they want, but this, of course, is when we're in an illegitimate government position, it doesn't really matter, but that's important to remember. And so I think that's very alarming that we're now going back into the direction. I mean, even at 9/11 timeframe, that was also, and it was all just because, well, fear. And now we can look back and go, oh, you mean the people they were funding and that they were working with, that are now working with Syria? It's like, this is always how these things go. And it's not left or right. It's simply your government. And so this brings us into the conversation of the just ubiquitous surveillance satellite network that's being built around. I mean, even just this image, it really does it's unnerving. Let me play something really quickly, actually. This is the image of mostly Starlink satellites, and it gives you the time frame from 2019 to today to show us how rapidly, completely unawares for most people, that this is happening around us in space. We have no idea what's going on. For all I know, this is not even actually what's happening. Like, I think it's so alarming that we have no way of knowing what's actually happening. But here's what we're being told is the reality, and I find this to be terrifying in and of itself. This is 2019 right here, and then it happens to go today. Now, minus the increasing red color, which makes it feel more ominous. It's actually pretty terrifying. Like I don't,
Yeah.
like, even if it's like a not with negative intentions, or it's just like it like makes me feel trapped. It makes me feel claustrophobic. I don't know. That just pretty
I think that is definitely terrifying, man. I hadn't seen that, but that makes sense based on what I was reading about the coverage of just how much it's been expanding. And
yeah,
I definitely believe I touch on in this article how, you know, the thing that people don't really understand is that the SpaceX company has been partnered with the military for a long time. I mean, right after 9/11, they were launching satellites for the NRO and for other agencies of the U.S. government, which we probably are not privy to at the moment. But this isn't anything new. So from the very beginning, Elon's company, I mean, this is just another example of how he is a military industrial complex contractor. Like this is all of his different devices, whether it's Starlink, which is just the commercial public version of what Starshield really is. And I think maybe that's part of the goal too. I mean, we can kind of look at the internet itself, we can look at cell phones, GPS, we can look at social media, all these different tools being funded initially by the military or with help from NQTEL, the CIA's venture capital firm. And sure, they have a public use. Hey, the internet, it's fun. You can post memes and cat pictures and stuff like that. But then there's maybe this deeper militaristic intelligence use for it. Same thing, right? GPS devices were used in military operations. And then eventually those GPS devices became connected with radios where you could communicate and track locations. And then once those transformed into what we call cell phones, smartphones, now those GPS devices, you know, radio communication. I was actually thinking about this yesterday. I was doing some research on the mafia yesterday and watching this documentary about the lengths that they had to go to catch these mobsters in New York in the 70s and 80s. And I'm talking about sneaking into people's cars, like being able to do this in 45 seconds, sneak in and put a bug in their radio, sneak into their favorite restaurant, all this kind of stuff. And now all they have to do is just get access to your phone and get the same information that they used to have to work so hard for to get a bug in your house, get a bug in your car, in your restaurant. They just turn on your phone and listen in. I mean, it's crazy, but yeah.
Really quickly on that point, though, I would say that we're past that point. Like, I legitimately think that's maybe like the 90s, like, or maybe early 2000s, right? Where your phone, like, they would have to again. I think we're at a point where whether the phones are easily accessible or that we're beyond that and we don't even understand that, like Wi-Fi 3D mapping audio, like the World Economic Forum was doing presentations about how they can use your Wi-Fi device to like not just map out what you're doing, hear audio, but almost like somehow, I mean, it gets crazy. But so my
to
point
tell
is,
how many people are in a house or in a room and things of that sort. Yeah.
But relaying, but also like audio and like all sorts of different relaying, like spying levels that are near ubiquitous. And then talking about the satellite, everything going into like Web3 and where all this stuff's going, like the new advancement of how the interconnected. I mean, that's what I think we are. Sorry, I jumped in. Go ahead.
No, you're making great points there. And yeah, so I mean, that's just what comes to mind when you show that video there, because I've been writing about this Starlink and Starshield, and everybody for the most part knows about Starlink. They, like I said, they understand the public version of this, which is like, if you live in a remote place, if you have bad internet access, all you have to do is just pop up this little Starlink antenna and boom, like you've got the best internet in the world. And it's just beaming down to you from these low orbit Earth satellites, low Earth orbit. And I just want to say that because for those who don't believe in space or believe the Earth's flat, even if you believe in that, and because I've seen people say all satellites are just balloons, though that is true. Some satellites are placed on balloons. But even if you think we're in a dome or whatever, you've seen Elon launches rockets up and they go about halfway up and they come down. The point that people need to know when they're sitting there and they're celebrating, they're like, oh my God, the space race is back. We're going to Mars and all this sort of stuff. What he's actually doing on those Falcon 9 rockets is launching low Earth orbit satellites for the National Reconnaissance Office and for various agencies of the U.S. military and intelligence.
These are possibly weapons.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we don't really know. The payloads are all classified. We know that some of them are satellites, but so the Starlink is like the public face. Starshield is the military side of things. And so now that he's got people all over the world celebrating Starlink, and we know Starlink is used in the Ukraine war there and other aspects of that, and people are celebrating it and loving it, and they're embracing the Teslas, which can listen in and spy on them at all times and be turned off remotely. Now we're starting to get little trickles of information about this classified $1.8 billion contract that SpaceX through Starshield has signed with the National Reconnaissance Office. And that hasn't even been fully confirmed. It's just based on a few different sources who spoke to Reuters and to the Wall Street Journal. All signs point to the NRO. The NRO is the agency that is the U.S. government agency that handles the creation and distribution of satellites. They've been around since the 60s, but they were actually a secret organization, much like the NSA, until 1992. When they finally admitted that they were, that they were putting up military satellites for different reasons. And there's a whole history that I get into in this article for those who want to know more about just some of the shady and weird things that the NRO has been connected to. But the big point here is, like you said, that they're creating that image that you showed was just the perfect illustration of that. And I did some digging and I was able to actually find a quote, which is where the headline comes from the head of the NRO, where he mentioned that statement that we're quoting from, so he's at this event by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, talking about how the National Reconnaissance Office is using satellites from SpaceX, from Starshield. And this was last year. So he said, from last June to December, we've probably launched 100 satellites. So we're going from the demo phase to the operational phase. We're really going to be able to start testing all of this stuff in a more operational way. What are they going to be doing? They are part of the proliferated architecture to go off of it and get us reasonably high resolution imagery of the Earth at a high rate of speed. Now you can't hide because you're constantly being looked at.
Now, I pointed this out the other night in the context of, whether it's the drone discussion we're having or anything else that we're seeing, these weird developments. I mean, it's interesting. He makes a point to say we're going from the demo phase to the operational phase where we're really going to be able to start testing out this stuff. So it's interesting to start seeing these things pop off, that's just one of the things to consider. But I want to ask you some questions about it. Like first is just a point to comment, is that it's interesting to me that these were contracts made with the government, with Elon Musk, during Biden's administration. So I'd love people to highlight for me how that makes sense in the context of this outsider fighting the deep state dynamic, which clearly Biden's administration is supposed to represent. Obviously, you know where I'm getting at. I just think it's interesting that we can't connect those dots for some people that love these partisan narratives. Very clearly, he's a military contractor for the government. And if they were somehow different, they wouldn't be working through Biden's administration. I think that's obvious. Did you want to comment on it at all before I...
Yeah, I mean, I think I referenced something to that extent. There's a line in here, I can't find it, but I basically say something to the effect of people who are defenders of Elon will just argue that he's just a smart businessman. He's like, of course, yeah, who cares? Yeah, he loves Trump, but if he's going to make money from the U.S. military or whatever, he doesn't care who's president, and that's smart. He's just being a good guy, a good businessman. He understands his tactics, and they'll try to spin it however they want. But I think to me, it more illustrates that he doesn't care who's in office, because him and the people he runs with, the Peter Thiels, the David Sachs, the other technocrat class, and even now we're seeing some of the other, allegedly left-wing opposite side of the Musk and Thiel technocrat class in the last few days, from Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Sam Altman, all donating $1 million to Trump's inauguration, that the technocrat class doesn't care who's in office, especially the billionaire technocrat class. Like, they bow their heads to the Zionists just like everybody else, just like Elon Musk did to go kiss the ring after that whole he's anti-Semitic thing last year. So yeah, they might be being smart business people, but not for the reasons you think, not because they care about us, because they care about their bottom line. They care about serving their masters. And, I really think people think Trump's in control here. I think it's obvious he's being played. Now, they may stroke his ego enough to make him feel like he's the one, wow, I got the richest man in the world on my back, and he listens to me. I put him in a position of power,
right?
As if they're not, already gathering so much data on everybody in all these ways. I mean, the other thing too, just to tie it in, just in the last couple of days before we recorded this, they announced that Grok is now, the AI on Twitter is now free for most people, with some limitations. And I kind of hint at this as well. And I don't know if this is where you want to go next, but the guy that I was just quoting from, the head of the NRO, he starts talking about artificial intelligence too. And because he basically said that now that we've got so many satellites and we have heaps of data coming in, there's no humans in the world that can keep up with this. So we're going to need help from artificial intelligence. And what I wrote here was, no doubt Elon Musk will be ready to offer some assistance in the form of data gleaned from Grok, the AI bot integrated into Twitter, which has gathered billions of data points from the platform's hundreds of millions of users. And I was just trying to like imagine what that could do of like, you've got Grok and he's building this XAI and stuff that people are just, not only just the posts they're making, but the people who are like legitimately having conversations with this thing and feeding it information. So it's getting all that data. And the military is now like, oh, we need help with AI. How hard is it to imagine that the next contract from Elon Musk is, oh, hey, we'll give you access to our Grok large learning model, and you can use that to filter through all the data you've gathered from your satellites.
Or that's how it started.
Yeah, maybe that's where it was already in the first place. But you know what I mean? Like, it's not that hard to see how these things connect. And I'll just quote from the guy again. He said, operating a proliferated architecture means that it's no longer possible to go off and for an individual sitting at a control center to say, I know what the satellite is doing. So we have to have the machines go off and help us there. We need artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automated processes to help us do that.
Man, there's so many openings there for so many different things. But so to go back to the point, to start that point, the part we just discussed, I agree with everything, but my point was more so about the idea that during Biden, that it should highlight that if the narrative that the deep state are Democrats or the Democrats are the evil side, just it's important to highlight that if that's the case, then explain why they would be contracting with Elon Musk for the future of Trump's administration, or why Trump and Biden are at the White House meeting to discuss how they're going to resolve Ukraine. Like, it just, I hope honest people out there who kind of fall into those circles can realize how obviously those things are being used for partisan reasons, not because it's true. And I just think that's important. And that's not to say that some of these things might partly be true. It's obvious how that works. But back to the other point, you had mentioned, well, you said some of the shady things about the NRO. Could you point that out, just at least one of the examples? Because I can highlight them in the article, but I wanted you to at least give one of those examples. Because if I remember correctly, there were some pretty crazy stories, right, around what they were involved with. They're now contracting with Elon Musk. I think that's relevant.
Yeah, I felt like it was important for people who'd never heard of the NRO to at least maybe know a little bit of the history. Like I said, they hadn't even been public till 1992, but pretty much within 5 years of them being public in 1996, you had a New York Times article titled "A Secret Agency's Secret Budget Yields Lost Billions," officials say. And so apparently in 1995, they lost $2 billion in classified money. So that was kind of an interesting thing. It made me think, of course, Catherine Austin Fitts and others who are always speaking about the trillions lost. And just here's another example of alleged money just being lost that they claimed later on, okay, we found $1 billion of it. Like, and there's no way to verify this as a public person. Like, obviously we could dig into the budgets, but we're talking about black projects here. These are classified, above top secret budgets that most of us never have access to. And so the claim that they lost billions of dollars and then found it is just funny. But it just as some reference to kind of give us an awareness of how much money this agency does use. In 1996, so almost 30 years ago, the NRO was running a $28 billion a year black budget, according to the New York Times. So that was 30 years ago, $28 billion already being pumped into this satellite agency here, the NRO. Before, this is a few years too before, as far as I could find, their first contract with Elon Musk and SpaceX. But just to think about that, I mean, a lot of us haven't been paying attention to these sort of things for 30 years. And while we were all, teenagers or young adults or whatever in the mid-90s, they've got a $28 billion black budget already at that point. Most of us had never even heard of them. So, I mean, I thought that was kind of interesting. One other one that I think people may remember is this, one of their launches of a spy satellite, which is officially known as USA 247 or NRO Launch 39. This was December 2013, which was just a couple of months after the Snowden leaks were starting to happen. And they were launching this satellite. It was being promoted by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, and they actually tweeted out a logo for this launch, which was, again, taking place December 2013. And the logo you guys may have seen around, or there it is right now for those watching the screen. The ODNI said, ready for launch, and Atlas V will blast off at just past 11, carrying a classified NRO payload. So that's what I mean. They have these classified payloads. We don't know what they are. It says also CubeSats, that's satellites. So it launched satellites and then some other classified things that we don't know about. And the logo is this crazy octopus wrapping its arms all around the world with saying nothing is beyond our reach. And they have their own explanation for why they chose that. You know, they try to like, oh, well, octopus symbolizes this and that, blah, blah, whatever. But here we are, fast forward to what, this was 2013, so 10 years later only, and we've got the head of the NRO saying with these new satellites they're launching, there's nowhere you can hide. Nothing is beyond our reach. I mean, it's right there. So just a little bit about, you know, some of the people that the Elon Musks of the world are partnering with. And you know, one other just kind of tidbit on this is more directly related to Musk, and just to kind of, because I end the article with hammering home the point that he's a technocrat, he's not a hero, for those who are still falling for that narrative. And I actually found this from another article when I was doing some research, but if you go to the Tesla website, and we do link this in the article on the Tesla like corporate website, and there's a profile for Elon Musk, he calls himself the Techno King, which, you know, he's a nerdy, weird guy, right? He's quirky. He's just being silly. He gave himself a silly title at his company. But it really reminds me of the historic technocracy movement. And I've talked about this before, that what I call the technocratic state, they originally called the technate. And they said there would be a North American technate that would know how much energy everybody's using. It would allocate, you know, energy credits and all this sort of stuff that sounds real familiar now. And at the head of that would be a technocrat king, at the head of the technate. And Elon calls himself the Techno King. Okay, it could be nothing, but to me, it's just like those little things that I feel like might end up being important in the long term.
Yeah, very much so. The last one I want to ask you, you mentioned in the article about specifically Starlink. Again, you kind of framed it as this like, you know, I mean, I'm sure in some cases it's helping people, right? I'm very suspicious about that. I don't think very few things are like that in this world from people like that. But that you mentioned that the NRO or simply the government intelligence kind of apparatus is in some cases might be piggybacking on the devices. Could you explain what that means? I think that's important for possible, you know, especially if it turns out that this is not some new thing, but there's rather, you know, like that Elon is another. Oh, I'm trying to make a good analogy, but like, you know, like DARPA on the internet, where it's like he's a project of ours, kind of an idea that it was always like that from the start. So what do you mean by
piggybacking? Yeah, and that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. Is like, you know, like I said, the internet, cell phones, social media, these devices and these tools that we are now ubiquitous in regular everyday life, they all have origins in the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence, and this could very much be another example of that. So what I was pointing out specifically is that just as of last year, SpaceX got its contract with the U.S. Space Force. This is apparently the first public one. There may be others, but the first public one that we know about. And it was specifically to, quote, provide customized satellite communications for the military under the Starshield program. And Starshield is going to give the military access to the SpaceX Starlink satellites for 1 year so far. And there was an Air Force spokeswoman that told Bloomberg that this is going to, quote, provide for Starshield, that the contract provides for Starshield to provide end-to-end service via the Starlink constellation. So they call these satellites constellations. And so basically they're saying like, now that Starlink has gone up there and it's provided all this internet for different people, we're going to go ahead and now get a contract with SpaceX to let us have access to all that thing. Now, I don't know what those details mean. Does that mean that they would have access to the traffic that's being transmitted through the satellites? I think it's absolutely possible, and I wouldn't put past them. And that's another reason why, to me, even if I thought like, not that any other internet service provider out there is necessarily trustworthy, but knowing what we know about Elon Musk, it would definitely make me feel skeptical of like having all of my data transmitted through his SpaceX network, Starlink network, which is part of SpaceX, which is a military contractor and is now working even closer with the military than they ever have before. So what I wrote was that the U.S. and intelligence will be piggybacking off the Starlink satellites, which are being sold to the average person as a convenient and fast way to access the internet. And the other point I kind of made earlier is when people are seeing, you know, like these the rockets, Elon Musk will tweet them and they'll do a live stream all day. Like, here's another rocket going up, and I see all these people celebrating. They're not thinking about the payload that we just discussed. You go smile and clap and like, yeah, we're going to Mars because the rocket went up in the air, but you don't see where it's letting off its payload and sending out more spy satellites to help the U.S. military build the largest spy satellite constellation in the world. And I think that's what it's really about. So Starlink kind of seems like it was just the foot in the door to get people accepting of, that, like what that picture showed, put satellites all over the entire globe. Yeah, it's going to help you guys have internet, and we're going to end the digital divide and help poor African farmers. And, where have we heard this before? Just think of the global South, and we're going to fix the world for them, we promise, and make it more equitable. Exactly.
Saving them that actually hurts them.
Yeah, and then now it comes out, well, actually, we're going to partner with the military and give them access to this same satellite network.
Right. Well, to your point, it is a perfect example. Grok is something that is being thrown out there. When something is free, it's you're the product is the point, right? And so ultimately Grok is out there, and we already know that Grok, they're using that data to facilitate their project. So what would be the difference of him letting them look at the data that's coming through the satellites? You know what I mean? Like, especially since he probably feels he's giving these things to people, so he probably has a right to that. Are you willing to bet you there's something in these contracts? The problem is that people that lean into this more often than not are of the mind that these are, like you said, heroes, saviors. They don't even think twice about whether there might be something nefarious going on there. And that's a problem. I don't think that's the majority, but I think there's a large group of that, most definitely. So let's talk about how this overlaps to kind of wrap up today, as long as we want, but about the idea of not just this point, but any other points in developing stories. Like, for example, AI being used in foreign policy situations, Palantir, Peter Thiel, and Israel, things like that. But specifically, the point that seems to be really grabbing the country's mindset right now is the drone fiasco, which, I mean, I'm in no way suggesting, I think it's pretty obvious that there are drones, and people are, these are some of them, I think probably half. Most of the ones I keep seeing fake are coming from the Joneses and even politicians that are sharing things that are debunked as star constellations. It's very interesting, but there are actual real videos. So I'm not denying that there are drones, but it seems very clear that this is something that we're all being directed to focus on, almost obsess over. And whether that's the reality or not, it is clearly adding to what we just talked about. It is creating justification for surveillance, for a satellite infrastructure that could potentially stop these, or a biometric system, or any number of things that were being, or the point you made earlier, which I don't think we brought up, actually. We talked about off air, a discussion about whether this whole thing is meant to distract us from Orwellian drone legislation that's going through right now. Or I would even argue the NDAA, which gave almost over $500 million to Israel for their genocide. We're not talking about these things. So anyway, go ahead, take the floor. What do you think about this?
Yeah, as you were talking about this, I just decided, let me just go see what's happening. And over on CNN.com, like one of the top stories is what we know about the mysterious drone sightings happening over dozens of U.S. states. Like, so right away, like this is, it's kind of the messaging.
Story of the day.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And because I honestly, we've talked about this before. I kind of, whenever there's a trending story, I'm just like, whatever, I'm not going to really pay too much attention to it. But this one isn't going away. And it seems like there's a reason for that maybe hasn't been revealed yet.
Real world consequences, right?
Like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, the main thing I've seen, like on Twitter and elsewhere, is people freaking out. Then I saw the FBI and the DHS, they put out a statement kind of downplaying what's going on. But then at the same time, there have been local officials in New Jersey and elsewhere, police and others saying, no, we know what we saw. We definitely saw something. You can see these images, and it's like all the different lights, which kind of look like to me what UFO sightings used to look back the day. Like, I'm not saying all these lights are connected to one ship or something like that, but I would lean towards the fact that this is, like, even this CNN article is referencing the War of the Worlds, which of course we know back in the day, War of the Worlds, there was a radio story being played and people flipped out because they thought it was a real alien invasion. I don't know if that's the kind of winking at us, but I do think what you mentioned, that we saw that article that was coming from Zero Hedge and aggregated by Free Thought Project about this legislation coming up related to drones. I think you mentioned earlier, and I think I saw something on Twitter about a Palantir drone contract that just got reported in the last couple of days. Mm-hmm. It seems like there's a lot of things happening with drones at the moment. It could be all just build up some panic so that whatever they're trying to pass gets through. It could be a distraction, like you said, because there's bigger things like giving more and more money to Israel, and who knows what else is hidden in the latest NDA. I'm sure they didn't get rid of the indefinite detention mentioned since 2012. That's been there for over a decade. But the other thing I would say is that a lot of times these discussions are all about trying to keep people feeling scared. And what happens when people feel scared? The military gets more money. It allows the politicians to come in and argue and say, look, this is exactly why we need a space force. This is why we need to militarize space. This is why we need to have an Iron Dome like Israel has. We need, whatever the particular thing might be, it generally speaking, in my view, like at just a basic level, not saying like, because I mean, there's deeper levels we could go in. Maybe this is Project Bluebeam. Maybe they are preparing us for a fake alien invasion, things like that. But at a more base level, at the most basic level, I think it's going to give more money towards military industrial complex contractors who can come in and say, well, we can provide anti-drone, equipment, or we can provide better, airspace protection, whatever. Yeah, there's the Red Cat contract, the one that was what I was just mentioning there. So there's a lot of different angles. Overall, though, I think this is just going to be another way that either they keep us afraid, and then the story stops being talked about, and we never get an answer. But for a couple of weeks, people were afraid about it, or it's used as a justification for giving the military more money and just continuing to militarize the space above us.
Well, that's exactly the thing. Is again, just like we pointed out many times today, whether this is a completely random event, or whether they manufactured it, or somewhere in the middle. The whole problem, never let a good problem go to waste example, right? It's something that will be used. Like I pointed out with the shooting, whether, sometimes there are just people that get shot. And my point is that when there's a large event, whether or not they manufactured something like that, the government who wants to will say gun control, right? It's using something in front of you. So my point would be, and I do think there's very clear hallmarks of manipulation in all of this, but I think we're at a point where there's far less information than I'm usually seeing. Like 90% of this conversation, even on like BBC and AP, are like anecdotal narratives. Like the entire article was like what somebody said and what they saw. And that seems very suspicious to me. But the obvious point you just made is that this very clearly seems to interconnect with the larger rollout of all of these things, right? The justification for, their own deployment of drones that are always hovering over us to keep us safe from the bad guy drones, which is what I wrote in this weirdly timed post from Palantir. It says, for more than 2 decades, we have been providing warfighters with mission critical software and blah, blah, blah. It's drones, right? So they're literally going, look at this new drone, discussion, basically new contracts for drones for the US and everybody else. And I said, hurry, rush out the good guy drones to save us from the bad guy drones. Thank you, Elon and Palantir. I just think it's very interesting. And so I recently did yesterday did a show about this where I go over the bigger topic, but I also highlighted some interesting connections to Israel specifically. Now, as I said in the show, I'm sure people will jump to the conclusion that I'm doing that because they think I'm focused on Israel, and there's some truth to that. I do think Israel is a very important, largely interconnected problem to a lot of the things happening in the world, but I wasn't like I was just blindly looking for it. There were things that popped up that I think are very relevant. For example, these are just general things. The point was there's an exercise we saw about drones with Ukraine and NATO and overlap, which was just a point about kind of a false flag dynamic. I saw that Israel is one of the leading drone providers in the world, but rarely is highlighted as that, and all these different points. And I thought it was relevant. But what I want to include in this, what you mentioned about the Palantir point, is that this was so this image, by the way, is from the Army-Navy game. And weirdly, Elon just shared this and cropped out the Palantir thing, which I think is funny. But here's the video that they shared at that game. Did you see this, by the way, before I play it? No,
I haven't seen this.
Palantir advertisement they played at that game. Think of the timing. Oops, where's my window? There we go. So, it's just pretty ridiculous, the timing of this. It's almost like the more on the nose they make it these days, the easier it is to kind of go, that can't be the case. You know what I mean? Like
that makes me feel more and more like this is a psyop.
Yeah.
Because I knew there was a football game and they were at it or something like that. But I hadn't seen that video. Definitely send me that tweet. I would like to share that around as well. Yeah. But yeah, things like that, I don't think those things are coincidental. Elon Musk, like I said, the Peter Thiel, the Trump, they're hanging out. There's a Palantir ad. There's a Palantir commercial in the middle of the game. And think about that kind of people, the people that are there. Like you probably got millions of people tuned into that football game just because Elon Musk and Donald Trump are there. And they keep showing them clips of, hey, look, they're hanging out, they're waving. And all the energy that's going into that. And the kind of person who would be at a game like that, and then they show them a commercial that I mean, what was that other than war propaganda? I mean, that's basically just like, hey, there could be somebody coming to attack us, but don't worry, we got you. We got all these drones and they're going to save you. At the same time that there's all this weird drone activity. And like you were pointing to earlier about Elon mentioning drones before this started to happen, mentioning like a swarm of drones or something.
Yeah, well, I was going to say real quick, and the next day they post this advertisement showing that they're rolling out with some new drone program to help fight. You know, it's just problem reaction solution as lazy as you can make it. But yeah, the point was, what were we saying? Oh, right here, the Zero Hedge article. So this is they came out the 14th. They put out a new one the next day, which was saying, you know, new theory. It was about the potential nuclear bomb sniffing thing. We can get into that if you'd like, but it all seems very much up in the air right now. And it seems like it's kind of set to manufacture this in a direction that rationalizes why this needs to happen, but at the same time, making it like bad Biden. It's a very weird dynamic, but the point was even Zero Hedge highlighted, well, let's take a step back and look at Musk's tweets. 2023, he says the drone wars are already a big deal, but we ain't seen nothing yet. September 29th, epic drone wars coming. September 30th, drone swarm battles are coming that will boggle the mind. Those are all there. What I find even more interesting, December 13th, this guy goes, hey, any thoughts on the mass drone sightings? So realize he's been hyping this as a very real incoming problem. And then when he asked while it's happening, he says alien spaceships controlled by Iran, obviously. To me, that was almost more revealing than any other answer, because and this is personally, obviously my opinion, but I get the sense that this is a game that they're playing right now where it's always real until it looks bad. Then we were always trolling, you know, and they play that very middle line where it's like, no, we were just trolling you with this thing. Either way, I find it telling that he's been telling us it's an incoming problem. The moment it starts happening, he kind of brushes it off as a joke. I don't know. Putting it all together, I very clearly feel, at the very least, it's being taken advantage of for what they're all involved with rolling out. But, you know, anyway, you know, kind of any thoughts here on what you think, how this connects, and, you know, whether we care about this.
We are being psyoped 6 ways to Sunday. I can't even just putting everything together from, you know, the spyware companies, from Starshield and the satellite and everything. Obviously, we've known drones were going to be a big part of the futurescape for quite some time. Again, another technology that they tell us, oh, you'll never have to leave home because drones will deliver everything to your house. And they only tell people the sort of public, fun, cool side of it. You'll have a personal drone assistant or a robot assistant or whatever. But clearly these things are intended to be used militarily, and they will, and they have been, and they were during COVID. Drones were used against people, whether that's shouting like, hey, make sure you're social distancing, go back inside or whatever. I also just want to point out real quickly to a piece that our friend James Corbett, also a member of the Independent Media Alliance, published last week on his website or on his Substack, called The Drone Wars You Are Not Prepared. And it was great timing by James, because I don't know if it was related to the New Jersey stuff going on, but I think he just was feeling like drawing people's attention, not only to like drones, like we're talking about unmanned aerial vehicles, but obviously drones like the quote unquote robot dogs, and they've got aquatic drones. They've got them hopping and running on things. And then now they've got, you know, they're making them, you guys might remember, they've talked about making like drones the size of hummingbirds or the size of dragonflies and stuff like that. I think James does a good job in that piece pointing out just how much drones are going to be a part of the future and coming war on free humanity.
And not to make it any more alarming, but let's realize that whether, you know, kind of a fine line these days between smart dust elements to tiny drones. I mean, at what point do we lose sight of what that really means? And is it internal? I mean, my God, the world is going in some very scary directions, and maybe we're already there, you know, so we're being slowly edged into what they've already done. You know, I mean, this is my worry, but so I'll just, you know, end with some points here that I think are relevant, as we just talked about, that ultimately Palantir very clearly is connected with the power structure and what they're rolling out. And let's not forget that right now in Israel, they are testing this stuff. As we saw the clip from Peter Thiel, like very, very uncomfortably being able to not address the fact that they're using AI to effectively kill children in Gaza. You know, in this case, their strategic partnership with Israel, this was in January of this year. This is very well into the genocide. And that's Karp and Thiel in this picture. And that's the whole, both sides of the paradigm dynamic, right? But what's worrisome is that right now in Israel, or rather in Gaza and Palestine, as they have been for decades, and this is not even a secret, testing things in this area that then get sold as battle tested. So I just want us to consider, and I'll even bring up this, you know, this one, just the one that seems to be the most recognized, the lavender one. There's also the Habsora, which is the earlier one, but the AI machine directing Israel's bombing spree in Gaza. That's Palantir working with Israel to ultimately carry out an AI killing machine. And this is citing IDF members. So my point is in Gaza right now, they're using drones, as we've seen. And I argue all of this right now is being real-time tested, and maybe we just kind of stepped into that real-time test. And ultimately, we have the NRO highlighting that the real-time, it's operational at this point, and as well as what I showed earlier a moment ago, back in just even May, Intercept was reporting that an Israeli company is hawking its self-launching drone system to U.S. police departments. And as I said recently in the conversation on my show, was simply, as we see this kind of Israeli tech startup deploying like chicken pox across our country, like just everywhere. We've got the carbine overlap where they're able to manipulate call center dynamics. We've got startup companies themselves, spyware, my point is not to say that those are the drones, but just realize how easy it would be for something like this to become almost impossible to see with the influence coming from these foreign powers, or just ask yourself whether we're being played like Derek was just highlighting. But either way, I do think it's concerning how all of this overlaps and is driving to more surveillance, more control. And so many seem to be blinded by it because they believe the person about to step into power is on their side. I hope you're right. But leave it there for today. Anything you want to end with to leave us with on the way out, Derek? And really, if you want to, I'll point out, by the way, the upcoming event that we're both going to be at. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that'd be great. No, I mean, I would just, I think this Red Cat and Palantir partnership, I definitely want to look more into that. And maybe I'll end up writing something about it because I do think it's going to be intriguing, because I see from one of the press releases, you mentioned Lavender, of course, but probably a few less folks remember Project Maven, which when it was first announced was a big deal because there was people from Google protesting that they didn't want to be involved and stuff like that. But Palantir, as well as other companies, were involved with the development of the Project Maven. And you've got Palantir's CTO and president bragging about how they have been, quote, providing warfighters with mission critical software and production AI capabilities, including Project Maven. And now they're looking forward to going forward. And interestingly, they have a program that is called Warp Speed. Their operating system is called Warp Speed.
So that's interesting. Yeah, it's who knows if that's just coincidental or not, but it does definitely feel an interesting nod. And I tend to think there's more interconnection than we realize. But yeah, I'll include a link. I was just trying to grab. Oh, here I got the just the People's Reset link. I'll include. But upcoming event we're both going to be at Derek's. She's responsible for putting this together in regard to the People's Reset, formerly known as the Greater Reset. I'm looking forward to this conversation and seeing your community, by the way, and everything going on there. But as I said before, I think it's a very important time for this conversation. I mean, it's always been important, but the idea of first of all recognizing that there are alternative solutions for all the things they want you to think. There's only one path, which is their technocratic control structure, but also just that we need to actively look inward, right, into how we will improve our lives and not just call for somebody else to solve everything for us. So thank you for putting all that together.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that, brother.
Yeah, and I just want to say, anybody who's interested, they can go to thepeoplesreset.org or thegreaterreset.org. It'll go the same place. We're 6 weeks away, pretty much as we're recording this, so there's still plenty of time to come hang out with Ryan, myself, and hundreds of other freedom lovers from more than 15 countries. Obviously, people from Mexico. It's just like Ryan said, it's a great time. If you're sick of just getting the information and just hoping that politicians are going to save you, or you already know they're not going to save you, and you're maybe looking for some ideas on how to get started for yourself, the People's Reset is a place to be. And the entire event is streamed for free online for those who can't come in person. But if you can, I do encourage you to come hang out, get connected, attend some workshops, listen to some talks, meet some cool people, and go home feeling activated. So thanks again, brother, for letting me come on today. And hopefully people are going to pay more attention to Paragon Solutions and to Starshield, because based on what I've seen from writing these articles, there's not too many people who are even aware of these companies.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I hope that this opens people's minds. So thanks again, Derek, for joining, and we'll see you next time. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.